Okay. Just let the YouTube system get set up. And then we will be starting in just a second. Okay, move that over there. And now we're ready. All right, YouTube is up. Zoom is up. Got people logging in. And we've got a long story today. So that means that we are going to go ahead and get started. I know I normally leave a little buffer, but we're going to try and do about 3,000 years worth of history in 60 minutes. So we don't have time to waste. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, you may have noticed in your studies on Judaism that we take our history very, very seriously. Now, that doesn't mean that this 1 hour session is enough history. This is meant to both whet your appetite to learn more about different times and also to show you some of the broad arc of history as it connects to Judaism. Additionally, we need to know our history because much of what we do today is a result of the history. We are continuing a story that was begun 3,000 years ago, and you can't understand this chapter unless you have read the previous chapters. So history is very, very important in Judaism, and I hope everybody will use this as a launching point or a refresher to get a little bit more history into their system. So let's start where Judaism starts. Well, when I say Judaism, I need to be a little bit careful, because when we're talking about Jewish history here, we are not talking just about the history of the people called the Jews or even the children of Israel. When we're talking about Jewish history, we are talking about the way Judaism looks at time as a whole. And for us, the scope of time begins with the beginning of everything. In modern terms, that might be called the Big Bang, but for us, that's called Bereshit. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But one of the things that we have to get down to very quickly, the focus of Judaism, is that God created the human, Adam, in his image. In God's image, he created him male and female. He created them. So the masculine, the feminine were created at the beginning to form a unified sense of what it is to be human, that we are a totality rather than a singular slice. And that role of the human is very, very important. We know that because by being singled out as something created in God's image, which has nothing to do with God's shape, but everything to do with God's spirit, we know that humans have a special place. We also know that the Lord God formed the human from the dust of the ground and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living creature. So the idea is that we are made with both the image of God, the Spirit of God, and we are made from the earth, from the ground, from the material. We are uniquely, we are a unique combination compared to all other creatures of both the material and the transcendental. And that is going to be a major part of our journey. Because indeed, once we eat from the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, God says, see, man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. So we are now given, again, uniquely this option to choose between good and evil, something that is different than all other creatures. A lion doesn't choose to be good or bad. A deer doesn't choose to be good or bad. They simply do what they will do without a deeper opportunity for moral reflection. Humanity we have that opportunity and therefore that obligation, which is why the very first story of humans' conduct outside this initial period of our creation involves a terrible problem, a crisis between two brothers, Cain and Abel, in which Cain is struggling with his desire to do his brother harm. God says to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? Surely if you do well, there will be lifting up. But if you do not do well, sin crouches at the door. Its longing is for you, yet you can master it." This then becomes the central tension for humans' existence, that we are pulled by parts of our instinct that lead us to do things that in moderation might be good. It is good to want to do better. It is good to want to have more. It is good to want to be with a loved one. But if allowed to be in control, if it masters us rather than the other way around, then it pulls us towards very, very negative activities, what we call sins. So his jealousy of his brother could inspire him to do better for himself next time, to give more and more honestly from his heart, or it could inspire him to do a very terrible thing, to murder his brother, to remove the source of him feeling bad. Unfortunately, Cain chooses the wrong way, and that sets him on a particular path. We skip ahead to the story of Noah, and Noah comes on the scene when God saw that the evil of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. One of the great problems that we see at the beginning of time is that once the society begins to emulate the behavior of Cain, where we are seeking out the more negative fulfillment of our desires, then it becomes very self-reinforcing. If I'm going to treat my neighbor badly, he'll treat me badly, we'll treat other people badly, and so on and so forth. And God needs to break that cycle. Indeed, it says that God regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. These are the generation of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generation, and Noah walked with God. With you, I will establish my covenant. And here we see really the beginning of what is going to become the tendency over the next couple thousand years, and that is the refining of the covenant towards the ultimate giving of the Torah. You see, the Torah is solving a problem, the problem of all of creation, which is God has made humanity, God has given us free will, we have the power to choose good or evil. We continually choose too often to do what is wrong, to the harm of ourselves and those around us. God realizes with the story of Noah that you can't just keep hitting the reboot button and try and reset the world, because immediately after Noah comes out of the ark, one of his sons is already misbehaving. And that is setting off the pattern again. So instead, God is going to try and make a covenant with one group to be able to at least nurture that growth, that potential. Unfortunately, we have to wait a little before that happens. We have to wait until the beginning of a person named Avram. And Abraham reaches out to Avram, as explained in the prophet Nehemiah. You alone are the Lord. You made the heavens, the highest heavens and all their host, the earth and everything upon it, the seas and everything in them. You keep them all alive, and the host of heaven prostrate themselves before you. That is the general description of the first few chapters of the book of Genesis. You are the Lord God who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and changed his name to Abraham. Finding his heart true to you, you made a covenant with him to give the land. This is the beginning of the second refining of the Brit, where God is now going to focus on Abraham and, at this point, some of Abraham's children, establishing for them a home, the land of Israel, and establishing with them a continually reinforced relationship to try and nurture them in the direction that God wants. Now, this does not mean that God does not also care about the rest of the world. God absolutely cares about each and every person. God cares about each and every human. God wants everybody to be happy and everyone to be good. However, this is the book that is telling the story of the Jewish people. And so it's not surprising that in that book, you're going to find an emphasis on the chain of events that leads to our unique role within the world. If I was reading a biography of Abraham Lincoln, I would expect to find mostly the story of Abraham Lincoln. Lots of other people lived when he lived. That doesn't mean I'm going to talk about all of them. I'm going to talk about Abraham Lincoln. So too the Torah, which was written as a record for us of the Jewish story, focuses on the highlights and the genealogical line that leads towards the Jewish people. There is nothing chauvinistic or exclusionary about that. It's simply the nature of how you write a book. So what happens? Well, we find out that this pattern that God is trying to establish, this reinforcement of a relationship with not only one person, but also with a group of people, is off to a bit of a rocky start. Originally, Abraham has Lot, his nephew, with him. That doesn't work. Lot chooses to go after material gain, and he gets separated. We see more generations as well following the same pattern. Isaac and Ishmael, only Isaac is able to stay in the path that Abraham has laid down. Jacob and Esau, only Jacob is able to stay in the path that God has laid down. So we see a non-growing family, father to son, father to son. The family is not getting bigger. We are not getting more people involved in this connection to God. Unfortunately, many people are leaving the path. The third generation starts off looking like that again, because we see the sale of Joseph. We see that the brothers are willing to turn on at least one of themselves. However, by the end of that story, they are reconciled. Joseph is brought back into the family, and the brothers are no longer turning on each other. That's why it's very important that they are defending Benjamin at the end, to show that now the family is willing to stick by each other. And it is with that family that we begin to make a transition towards a nation. Again, going back to the prophet of Nehemiah, we see that Egypt then becomes the formative area, the formative zone, for the establishment of our people as a nation rather than just a family. Now, what's the difference between a nation and a family? Well, in a family, you know all the people of your family, and you are related to all of them by very close blood ties. Cousin, maybe second cousin, depends on your family, but most people are very, very close and know everyone, both genetically as well as personally. A nation, on the other hand, has people bound together without those close bonds of family. At this point, we are getting large enough in Egypt to no longer really just be one big family, but now we are a nation, and we're going to need a glue to hold the people together that is more than just having the last name. We see in Nehemiah, you took note of our father's affliction in Egypt and heard their cry at the Sea of Reeds. You performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh, all his servants, and all the people of his land. You split the sea before them. They passed through the sea on dry land, but you threw their pursuers into the depths like a stone into the raging waters. You led them by day with a pillar of cloud and by night with a pillar of fire, to give them light in the way they were to go. So this is not only telling us that God brought us out of Egypt, which is the singular act which unifies the people who, as I said, had become too large to just be called a family. Now they are the people who experienced the exodus of Egypt. This is bonding them together and giving them a new calling. But we hear explicitly that this is being done through God's help and God's leadership. And this then leads us to the ultimate moment when the world changed, the gift of Sinai, the gift of Torah. This moment where the Israelites are at Mount Sinai, where they received Torah, is not just one more step out of everything we've been doing. This is what God has been hoping to do with this family since the very beginning, since Adam, indeed. Since we have free will and since we are choosing, what we truly need are instructions. However, instructions that are just given carte blanche to the entire world don't actually work. if you'll pardon a small digression just to go into a little bit of legal theory, you can't simply give the same instructions to the entire world and hope that, everybody will follow them. Instead, since you are depending upon free will rather than some authority, God is not putting people in jail, God is not throwing lightning bolts, we are left to our own path to find justice. That means you need to have a community, a group of people who are committed to implementing the laws in large enough number while remaining together that those laws can take root and can actually become the culture of that community. And that means you need a captive audience. We were literally captive in Egypt. You need a group that is eager and willing to accept all of these rules together and to implement them together so that they will become part of their nature, part of their culture, part of their civilization, their heritage, their history. And that is why this gift at Mount Sinai was so central. God could have sprinkled the Torah all across the world and given it to everyone, but you would have found one person here, one person there, two people there, who might have been interested and willing to try and live by Torah, but without the reinforcement of each other, without being able to build the community that would share an understanding of what was right and wrong, what counted as theft, what counted as lost, what counted as damage, and all the ways of ruling on those cases. Without that shared understanding, we never would have been able to get anywhere. Most legal types of shared understanding in the ancient world and really in the modern are built on some implied form of coercion, meaning that ultimately the government will force you to obey the laws. Ultimately, you will be punished if you do not obey the laws. Judaism begins with the idea that we are ultimately free, ultimately able to choose to do right or to choose wrong. And although there may be some punishments, the punishments are not immediate, nor are they going to be always perceptible. Therefore, you need to grow a willingness, a belief, a faith in the rules. And that's why this whole arc had to wait until this amazing moment when we left Egypt and came to Sinai, when we were in the proper mode to accept. And then indeed, it's explained, I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, the Lord, am your God. God didn't take us out of Egypt just to make us not be slaves. That was absolutely important. But even more important was that after having left Egypt, we would be prepared to accept God as our God and therefore accept the rules of Torah as our rules. Again, Nehemiah in his beautiful summary says, you came down on Mount Sinai and spoke to them from heaven. You gave them right rules and true teachings, good laws and commandments. You made known to them your holy Shabbat, and you ordained for them laws, commandments, and teaching. Through Moses, your servant, you gave them bread from heaven when they were hungry and produced water from a rock when they were thirsty. You told them to go and possess the land that you swore to give them. That's all the good and preparing for us. But they, our ancestors, acted presumptuously. They stiffened their necks and did not obey your commandments. And this is where we hit the first major bump in the road. We've already been complaining a bit by this point, but this is the first major digression from the plan. The idea was that we would reach the land of Israel after having received Torah, and that first generation would be the ideal group to translate Torah into life in a country where they would be free to do so. Unfortunately, they weren't quite ready. Now, unlike the times of Noah, unlike the times where Ishmael or Esau were breaking off, God did not start over. There was talk of that. You may remember a number of speeches between God and Moses regarding God proposing stopping the people of Israel and starting over with Moses alone. But Moses argues very convincingly for our benefit. Obviously, God didn't need persuading, but we needed to hear the counter argument that indeed God needed to stick with this people. God could not go back to the pattern of Noah, could not go back to the pattern of Abraham's immediate generations of just discarding the people who weren't loyal. God had to work with what God had and translate that into a good people. And indeed, with 40 years, that worked out. We eventually do have that point. Now we enter the land of Israel, and we are, after the time of Joshua, we are under the leadership of judges. And this is changing our people even more. We were originally under Moses and Joshua, united under a single leader who had prophetic insight into God and God's will. However, following Joshua, we now are led by different judges, judges who are indeed also touched by God and have some prophetic ability, depending upon which judge we're talking about, but none of them rule the entirety of the people. None of them represent the entire nation. They represent sections or tribes, but they don't have a unified command of the people or respect of the people. And that allows for very uneven performance of the commandments and results. Again, continuing from Nehemiah, the sons came and took possession of the land. You subdued the Canaanite inhabitants of the land before them, the time of Joshua. You delivered them into the power of their adversaries who oppressed them. In their time of trouble, they cried to you. You in heaven heard them, and in your abundant compassion gave them saviors who saved them from the power of their adversaries. But when they had relief, they did what was evil in your sight. So you abandoned them to the power of their enemies, who subjugated them. Again, they cried to you, and you in heaven heard and rescued them in your compassion time after time. This is the pattern we see throughout the book of Judges and really into the book of Shmuel, Samuel as well, where we are seeing the people turning to God and then turning away from God. Again, we're going back to that same dilemma of Adam Rishon, the first human. We have the option to choose right, but we keep choosing to do wrong. When we do wrong, things are bad. When we do right, things get better. It goes back and forth, back and forth. We are still uneven in our commitment to God and to God's commandments. But God is working with us. God is not abandoning us. God is not giving up when one generation is doing poorly, but instead continues to try and encourage us to turn to God. That's the crying out. And that God then reveals that there is help at hand, which can prevent the material problems we're having and give us room for turning back to God more fully. But it goes back and forth off and on, which is why we end up in the book of Samuel needing to move to a different model. The judges do not seem to be working, and the nation seems to recognize this, although how they express it is not ideal. All the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel, and they said to him, "You have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways." They have been pretty horrible, in fact. "Appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations." Samuel was displeased that they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied, "Heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you. For it is not you that they have rejected. It is me they have rejected as their king. Like everything else they have done ever since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods, so they are doing to you. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them." So God is pointing out that had they been willing, each individually, to commit to a life of the commandments and connection to God, they would not need a human king. They would have God, which would be the best king you could possibly have. Since they are not willing to do that on their own, the people are willingly, as a one-time deal, giving up their freedom to be bound to a human king that will be able to order them to do what is right and order them to do what the nation needs. So they are giving up their individual freedom to choose between right and wrong and asking for a king to help push them in the right direction. However, we can already see the implied warning here that that's not quite the way all human kings work. It's the ideal, but certainly not the normal pattern. And we get the king Saul, who starts, and Saul is not great. However, God sticks with Saul for a while until we see that Saul is willing to ignore one of God's direct commands, specifically involving the Amalekites. Once that happens, once the king sets himself up as above God's command, then God has to say, we're done. You're out. That cannot be the king, that the model of king that takes hold in Israel. You have to see yourself as a servant of God. That's why you have to write your own Torah, why you have to keep it with you, and why you don't get to make laws that overrule Torah itself. And as such, God then needs a new king, and God chooses David. Now, David does much better. We see in him not a perfect king. He certainly makes mistakes, some pretty big ones, but when he makes the mistakes, he doesn't make excuses. Instead, he does tshuva. He returns to God. He confesses what he does. He says that he is sorry, and he seeks forgiveness. We also know from his songs and from his psalms, the Tehillim, that he has a deep spiritual connection to God. So we see a much better model for the king, but still some problems, especially in how he's running his family. And that's why we end up with Solomon, who is the best of David's children, but still not perfect. And we see in God's statement to Solomon the potential for what might go right and what we know eventually will go wrong. The Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "Ask, what shall I grant you?" Meaning God is offering to give him his wish. Solomon said, "You dealt most graciously with your servant, my father David, and now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father. But I am a young lad with no experience in leadership. Your servant finds himself in the midst of the people you have chosen. Grant then your servant an understanding mind to judge your people, to distinguish between good and bad. For who can judge this vast people of yours?" Now, first of all, we should be giving big thumbs up here. He is asking for the ability to tell between good and evil. That is something that should make you bing, 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 remember all the way back at the beginning, the story of Adam and Chava, the Garden of Eden. That is the ultimate choice we have to make. And Solomon recognizes that as king, his decisions about good and bad will affect not only himself, but will affect the nation. And so he wants additional insight into doing this. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. It is, after all, the whole point of everything. And God said to him, "Because you asked for this, I now do as you have spoken. I grant you a wise and discerning mind. There has never been anyone like you before, nor will anyone like you arise again. And I also grant you what you did not ask for," meaning wealth and the security, "if you will walk in my ways and observe my laws and commandments, as did your father David." So at the end, we still see that very important caveat. God is giving Solomon his wish of a wise mind, but he is pointing out that the benefits of the kingdom, the blessings of the kingdom, will only be able to continue as long as he actually follows in the ways of God. This is not a one and done kind of arrangement. This is something that is contingent upon his performance according to what God is showing him. Unfortunately, Solomon is not such a great king, and near the end of his life, the kingdom begins to have many troubles. Much of it is brought about by his expansion, and which also brings in idolatry. Yes, he builds the temple, but he also builds many fortresses and palaces, and he does so with forced labor, meaning a type of slavery for the people. And when he died, the people wanted relief. His son gets the option, and he is approached by the nation at the time of his coronation. And they ask him, they say to him, "Your father," meaning King Solomon, "made our yoke heavy. He worked us hard. Now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke which your father laid on us, and we will serve you," right? "Just give us a break, and we will be so thankful and loyal to you." He answered to them, "Go away for 3 days and then come back to me. Give me time to think about it." King Rehoboam took counsel with the elders. They answered him, "If you will be a servant to those people today and serve them," meaning doing what they're asking, "and if you respond to them with kind words, they will be your servants always," meaning show them that you understand and give them a little bit of a break from what was going on under your father, and they will become your loyal subjects forever. but he ignored the advice the elders gave him and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him, meaning his young buddies. They answered, "Say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins." And yes, that is as rude as it sounds. "My father imposed a heavy yoke on you, and I will add to your yoke. My father flogged you with whips, but I will flog you with scorpions." Basically, if you think my dad was tough, I'm going to be even tougher. He's all about bragging and bravado and brashness and machismo and all of that. And of course, it totally backfires, and we end up with the nation being torn in half, with the northern tribes becoming the kingdom of Israel and the southern tribes being the kingdom of Judah. The northern tribe is eventually destroyed eventually destroyed by the Assyrian kingdom under Sennacherib. And when that happens, we find out, as that builds up to happen during the hundreds of years of rise, we see that all of the northern kings and most of the people break the rules of morality. They worship idolatry. They give in completely to that crouching presence at the door, all the way back mentioned with Cain, and that destroys their entire nation. Eventually, in 722, the Assyrians come in. They destroy the north. They carry off the vast majority of the people, and those people become scattered across the Assyrian Empire and beyond, and they become lost. When people talk about the lost tribes of Israel, this is who they are talking about. And despite whatever random conspiracy thing you may have read on Facebook or seen some silly YouTube video, they are still lost. Nobody has found them. No one is identifying them. Please do not pay anyone to take a DNA test to prove that you are part of these lost tribes. This is something that we will wait for the time of Mashiach for redemption, and then it will be clarified. In the meantime, just keep your money and pray for redemption for the world. All right, I just need to take a quick drink, and this is a decent place to break. All right, so that's the Northern Kingdom. What about the Southern Kingdom? Well, the Southern Kingdom had a few good kings, namely Hezekiah and Josiah, but basically they were still having a lot of trouble. Although idolatry was not as prevalent within the Southern Kingdom, it was still very common, and under most of the kings, it was allowed to exist, even while the temple was being run according to the dictates of the Torah. However, over time, it got worse and worse and worse until in 586, the Babylonians came in. We made an alliance with Egypt, thinking they would help us. They didn't. And we ended up being destroyed by the Babylonians. It's important to point out the Babylonians were only asking us to be part of their empire, something we would end up doing under Persia for a few hundred years, and then under Alexander, and then under Rome. So it's not as though being part of another empire was impossible for us, but it was our own bravado, thinking that we could endure specifically by using might rather than right, that we could survive the Babylonians without actually changing our behavior the way the prophets had told us to do. Unfortunately, it turned out that isn't how it works. So now we need to go to a little bit further, because we are now in the edge of the Tanakh of the Bible and moving towards the post-biblical period. So without the temple, without the homeland, without Israel, right, we could have just spread into the winds, the same way the northern tribes did, and the same way that countless other nations and tribes and people did during this time of these mighty empires. But we built something special that was portable and powerful. We built what we would now recognize as the synagogue. In Babylon, we would take out the Torah and we would read, we would chant and sing the Psalms, we would practice the mitzvot, the commandments, which we could do no matter where we were. And that sustained us. That allowed us to remain united. That shared culture that we had seen born in the time of Sinai was equally able to survive outside the land of Israel. It was born outside of Israel after all, and therefore we were able to continue despite this horrible episode in our history. And in fact, because we could continue, in about 70 years after the Babylonians fell to the Persian Empire, we found a more agreeable emperor who was willing to allow us to return. And we weren't fully independent. We were still a vassal state of the Persian Empire, but we could at least run our own country, which was much smaller than it had been, according to the rules of Torah and our people. This is the time, This is the time, by the way, of the story of the book of Esther. And this book of Daniel as well is set in this transition period. Now, after the Persians, we get the Greeks, well, specifically the Macedonians. Alexander the Great conquered the Persians, and when he took over in around 332, he continued the Persian policy of tolerance, which meant we still owed him tax money, but we could continue living our life as we chose. When he died in around 323 BCE, we became part of the Ptolemaic Empire. That was based in Egypt, and it was run by his general Ptolemy, who took over that section. After much back and forth and battle between him and the Seleucid Empire, which was to the north, we eventually became part of the Seleucid territory in 201. That was the period during this time when Hellenism, Greek culture and ideas began to take hold. And that should then make you think about the story of the Maccabees. In 168 BCE, there were some very strong policies put in place by Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who was the emperor of the Seleucid Empire, and the Jewish people did not like that. Well, I say the Jewish people, there were some Jews who thought it was a great idea. Hey, let's all just be following this Hellenistic idea. However, the majority of the Jews, led by the Maccabees, fought back and miraculously were able to win. And this is our first breath of independence since the Babylonian conquest in 586. So you can notice that we've gone almost 400 years without actually being an independent nation. Now we are independent again. This is also, by the way, the first time in human history to date that I've been able to find where a people fought not for their physical independence or land control or resources, but fought just for religious freedom. It was really a remarkable story, which we talk about in the Hanukkah class, so we'll move on. Now, the Maccabees, whose family was known as the Hashmoneans, they were not great kings. There's a lot of reasons why they shouldn't have been king, most importantly because they weren't descended from the line of David, but were descended from Aaron, because they were Kohanes, but they did not do a great job. And that meant that eventually they invited the Romans in. Two Hashmoneans were fighting over becoming the next king, and each of them appealed to Rome, which was the up-and-coming power in the Mediterranean, and the Romans picked the winner, and the Romans set up their army inside of our territory. So we lost our independence over their squabble for who would get to be king. And this was the beginning of the next phase of oppression and eventual destruction. Now, by 337 BCE, they are already picking the kings because they've decided the Hashmoneans aren't good enough for them. They're too unreliable. You know, they might have their own thoughts of independence. And so they appoint Herod instead. Herod is not great. And Herod is, well, as we know, a terrible person who kills all of his family, meaning the Hashmonean family that he married into, because he doesn't want any rivals. The people are not happy during this time, and we have numerous revolts against them, the most famous of which was in 66 to 70 CE. This is the one that is recorded in the Wars of the Jews, written by Josephus. And it was at the end of this war when the Second Temple was destroyed. It is also during this time period when the Zealots took to refuge in Masada for one of the final stages of this fight. But we're not done with Rome yet, even though we lost that battle. We have another revolt in 115 CE, and then a very almost successful revolt led by Bar Kokhba in 132 to 135. Almost successful revolts, however, are not great. If you almost throw off Rome, it just means Rome gets even angrier when they come back. And they instituted even harsher punishments. They deported huge numbers of slaves, and the taxes and policies were so bad that many people just emigrated outside of Israel. Now, you may be wondering, well, where are they going? Well, it turns out the Jews who had come back from Babylon, all the way back during the Persian period, left many people behind. Many people chose to remain in Babylon. During the period of the Persian Empire, the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid Empire, and even during the Roman Empire, Jews also immigrated to many other countries, whether it be in Asia Minor, what we might call Turkey, into the areas of Greece and Italy, and also across North Africa, Egypt and Tunisia in particular. So there were Jews living everywhere, even as life within Israel became harder and harder. Now, the community in Israel did continue to survive. There was strong rabbinic leadership, because this is the time when now, without hope for political independence and without hope for a rebuilding of the temple, what we are left with is only the mitzvot for a very long time. And that means the interpretation and teaching of the mitzvot becomes even more critical. And the portability of knowledge, the portability of wisdom, becomes our greatest treasure. And this is really the period where rabbinic leadership becomes dominant, and much of what we do today will look very, very familiar. Most of us may have a hard time imagining the sacrifices. Many of us might have a hard time imagining the kingship, but most of us know what it is to belong to a synagogue, to be in a community, to have Jewish friends, maybe occasionally listen to the rabbi. This then becomes the pattern that will continue for the next 2,000 years. And during this time was when we created the last great universally accepted collection of Jewish literature. We created Midrashim, well, rather we wrote down Midrashim, which captured the interpretation of the Torah. We wrote down the Mishnah, which collected the clearest teachings of law, which you can go back to the second or third class this year, where we talk about these books. And this collection of knowledge allowed for those Jews who lived there or elsewhere to have a continue to have their knowledge and wisdom connected to our traditions. Okay, another drink before we move into our next stage. Any questions so far? Remember, this is meant to be very, very general view, but hopefully you're getting the overall arc of moving through history based upon our choices, whether we choose to do right or wrong, and guidance to make sure we can do better and better. We've actually been getting closer and closer to that. Unfortunately, we've had a number of setbacks, right? We are finding that more and more of the people are following Torah more commonly. Still violations, of course, people are not perfect, but we are getting to be a stronger and stronger community for understanding God's instruction.
I got a question, Rob.
Yes.
Outside the Jewish community, when a person asks if we are a Jew or something like that, they think that being a Jew is part of like a conversion to a religion.
Right.
And I think it's like 90% of the person think like that. What will be the right answer?
Right. So, Judaism is a unique blend of both religion and civilization. And that is something that is not always understood by people who are not part of that kind of connection. So we do emphasize the religious aspect because people can become Jewish. You can choose to become Jewish. However, when you become Jewish, you're not only saying, I believe, blah, 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 blah. You are saying, I will do, blah, 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 blah. That you are going to be committed to the markers of our civilization and culture, which is the commandments, the Torah, the mitzvot, and the way that we have been trying to live them, the broad structure of our culture as well. And so it is certainly advantageous and something we wish to give to our children from day one so that they can grow up saturated in that. But it is something that can be acquired as well. So they're right for being confused, because the later monotheistic traditions of Christianity and Islam don't have that same feel of being both religion and civilization. They focus almost universally on the religious aspect and allow the culture to just be whatever your local culture is. And so it's right for them to be confused, but explaining that our religion demands more than just a statement of belief, but demands a set of actions which binds us together in both space across the world and time across history, is a more complete answer. All right, so let's talk about this next period. We are now in the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as Byzantium. And even as the Western Roman Empire began to fall apart, this Eastern Empire continued to be quite stable. However, life was still becoming harder and harder if you lived in Israel. There were a couple of times when things looked like we might get a good emperor, but it didn't work out. Now, during this time, our studies continue. We're still debating what is right, what is wrong, how to live according to what God has given us. And all of those debates and discussions eventually are collected and edited together to become what we call the Talmud. This first Talmud was known as the Jerusalem Talmud. Sometimes it's also referred to as the Palestinian Talmud. It's important to just remark that the word Palestinian refers to the name that the Romans gave to this territory, what we call Israel. It does not refer to an ethnicity. So it's simply saying the Talmud written during the time of when Israel was called Palestine by the Romans. But that's really long-winded, so we usually call it the Jerusalem Talmud. Although important trivia, it wasn't written primarily in Jerusalem because for much of this period, Jews were not allowed to live in Jerusalem. Instead, we lived in the northern cities of Israel, in the Galilee, and in particular in Tiberias. But Jerusalem, of course, is a more powerful part of our cultural history. Now, in Old Babylon, that is to say, in the place that was previously called Babylon, but we don't update our names all that often. So at this point, it's still under Persian rule at that corner of the world. We were doing all right. Life there was much more tolerable. We were being treated better by the local rulers, and we were joined by more Jews immigrating from Israel who were trying to escape life under Rome. There were massive academies built there. There was continued discussion and refinement of our understanding of Jewish law and belief. This eventually gets to Talmud version 2, called the Babylonian Talmud. And this book then becomes the capstone of the shared literature of Jews everywhere, meaning wherever Jews end up after this point, the Talmud is the last book that all the communities agree is a correct summary of Jewish ideas. After this period, we get another group of leaders called the Gaonim, and they try to officially refine and continue the process of teaching. However, as communication becomes harder and harder, their ability to instruct and inform communities around the world becomes less and less possible. And so different communities become more and more on their own. Now, they're not completely on their own. They still write letters and get answers. This is, in fact, how we get the first text for the first thing that we'd call a Siddur, a prayer book, is from one of the questions from a far-flung community. But they're making more and more choices for themselves. In particular, we end up with a lot of Jews who are now moving up into Europe. Like I said, we were already there from Roman times, but as the centuries went on, Europe was a more and more inviting place to be. During what is often called the Dark Ages, from the fall of Rome through the Middle Ages, we had a mixed experience, right? We were not bound into the feudal system, lord, knight, peasant, or serf, but we were not protected by it either. So that meant we often could be given special privileges, but we also could have those privileges taken away. Now, since we had some perks, namely our international connection to Jews who lived in other countries, that meant that trade became something that Jews were quite famous for. It doesn't mean that everybody was involved in trade. We weren't all merchants. Many Jews did all the local crafts that you would imagine during the Dark Ages. Some, in some places, were allowed to be farmers or herders, but we did have a very prominent presence on the international trade scene. That'll be important later. And even during the age of Charlemagne, Jews were actively invited to come into the empire because the Jewish community would often bring with it those connections which would let a country or a city do much better economically. At the other end of the world, at least the Jewish world at this time, we see the foundation of Islam under Muhammad in 610 CE. Now, Islam wrestles for dominance in Arabia, and at the time, it was not very good for the Jews. Although Islam has much that is in common with Judaism, an emphasis on a non-physical God, an emphasis on there being only a God, a complete antagonism towards idolatry. Unfortunately, many of the early times were not very positive towards Jewish communities. Now, Islam eventually prevails against the other tribes of the Arabian Peninsula and begins a pattern of conquest and either incentivized or forced conversion, depending upon which person was in charge and which country we're talking about. In 637, they captures Jerusalem, and they allow Jews to return to the city, but in fact enforce what will be called the Pact of Omar. Now, this pact continues to be official Muslim policy for about 1,000 years at least, which states that Jews cannot build new synagogues, they cannot pray loudly, and they can't stop Jews from leaving and becoming Muslim if they wish. Additionally, they can't hold legal posts, and they have to wear a yellow star to be identified. And yes, that is true. It was not invented by the Nazis. Many different communities have forced Jews to wear identifying marks to make it easier for them to discriminate against us. This is one of the first. Now, it wasn't always bad between us and Islam. In fact, there were many periods of times where our relations with our Muslim neighbors was much better than our relationship was with our Christian neighbors. We often had a more peaceful existence. We often were able to thrive better culturally and economically, and be given the freedom to develop ourselves intellectually. So there were times of what we call the Golden Age during this period, where you had some of the greatest Jewish philosophy, poetry, science being created, often alongside or in friendly, good-natured competition with scholars within the Islamic world. And it created a lot of good. On the other hand, during the same time period, if you had a new caliph come into power, or if a different person conquered your city, all of a sudden, things could change, and there could be forced conversions, there could be expulsions and other problems. So it was not a perfect time by any stretch of the imagination, but it did produce some absolute wonders of Jewish civilization. If you are familiar with Rambam, with Maimonides, he is a product of this time. So is Judah Halevi. So are almost all of the greatest poets that are referred to throughout our Siddur. So this did have some wonders going for it. Meanwhile, and also partly what precipitates some of the worst repercussions against us, in Europe, there is a rising drive towards religiosity, and to be very blunt about it, an attempt to capture trade routes to the east. Yes, the same drive will eventually fund the drive for exploration, which leads to the finding of the New World and the colonization and all of that slaughter. But back in 1095, the Catholic Church decides that they need to retake the Eastern Roman Empire, in particular to retake the Holy Land, in particular to take the trade routes. Whatever their actual reasons were, since many people joined out of piety and others joined out of greed, for us, it was not a good point. 1095 goes down in history as the beginning of the massive decline of Jewish fortunes in Europe. Tens of thousands of Jews were killed in Europe, as many of the crusading armies decided to kill the Jews who were at home before they got to kill the Muslims who were abroad. When the Crusaders arrived in Israel, they killed more Jews there as well. There were mass forced conversions under the Catholic armies, and this militant piety meant that our relationship with many of our Christian neighbors began to evaporate. We used to have a reasonable peace. It wasn't exactly equality, not close, but there was an understanding that we were not going to be the target of the local religious authorities. Unfortunately, from the Crusades on, that is what happened. And that meant that for us, on our part, we also had to deal with a rising mistrust of outsiders, as we were felt betrayed by our Christian neighbors. We began to look more suspiciously on them from this point going forward. We also lost a very important economic advantage, as the Crusades did open up the eastern routes for trade for the Christian merchants. It meant that their massive advantage in capital numbers, as well as preferential treatment by their people, meant that Jewish mercantile advantage began to also disappear. This then leads into a rising circle and chain of persecution. Their rising nationalism, their xenophobia, their religious fervor, right? All of this eventually leads to Christian wars, but it also leads to attacks against us. And it also leads to the beginning of towns and eventually countries kicking Jews out. Now, many of them do eventually invite us back in, but this process begins to become a familiar part of the landscape of European history. It is also what eventually drives Jews further and further east into Poland, into Russia, and to then suffer as a consequence in the 20th century. Now, this time period also created more insular communities because the Jews were ghettoized. I'm sorry. I don't normally get that many phone calls at this time of day. We were forced into Jewish-only neighborhoods. The gates were locked on us at night. You can even call this a little bit like a prison. And that is where we were forced to live. That meant that we also see a beginning of Jewish poverty in many parts of Europe, as much of our livelihood is taken away and much of our ability to move is also being taken away. And we suffer economic catastrophe after catastrophe as we are persecuted or expelled from different communities. At the same time period in Islam, we are also seeing a decline from the science and culture of the golden age of Islam. Following the Mongol invasion, and yes, the Mongols messed up a lot of things for many people, including us, there is a continued pressure from Europe, meaning the different waves of crusades. Islam becomes more conservative in its outlook. Its communities settle into an intellectual stalemate and becomes a bit stagnant, if you'll pardon the expression. And that pressure from outsiders means that there is more tension to inside groups like us who live among the Muslims. So the fact that we are living there means that our fortunes, our communities are suffering at the same time as the Muslim communities are declining. This is only sped up when European exploration bypasses Muslim trade routes going around Africa or eventually going all the way to the West. And that means that they are no longer connected to not just the wealth, but also the growing knowledge of the Western world. They had seeded the Renaissance, the Muslim communities, through many of their translations of ancient works, but unfortunately, they don't get to reap the benefits as they get bypassed by the communities that are continuing to advance many of those ideas. Now, Jewish communities called Mizrahi, which are the native Jewish communities to the Middle Eastern countries, they, of course, share these effects. But they are going to be joined in large part very soon, because in 1492, the Spanish rulers eventually reconquer the peninsula of Spain and Portugal, and the Spanish will eventually decree that all Jews must leave or convert. Now, Many previous rulers had made that same kind of order. We had lived through it before, and many people chose to simply say, yeah, fine, whatever, and practice their Judaism in secret, waiting for things to just go back to the way they had been before, until they get bored of hunting us down or talking about it and making their speeches. Then we'll go back and be Jewish in the open. Unfortunately, 1492 was a watershed year. This time was different. They instituted the Inquisition, which would rigorously investigate anybody suspected of being Jewish secretly and would torture and murder them. Many Jews were killed at this time, were burnt at the stake. Many more were pushed further and further into hiding. And this was a huge problem for the Jewish world. Now, many other Jews did choose to leave at this time. And many of them who fled ended up in North Africa. Many of them ended up in the Middle East, Turkey, and Greece. Some did also end up in the land of Israel, and some also went to Holland, and others went to the New World. That is why the many Jewish communities that live in these places are called Sephardic, meaning Spanish, even though they haven't lived in Spain for centuries, even though their family may speak Turkish, may speak Greek. They are Sephardic because they have carried the Sephardic culture, the Sephardic Jewish practices, and the Sephardic Jewish cultural style into these other states. Some of that gets blended with the more local Mizrahi, the Middle Eastern Jews. Some of it remained separate. Okay, we are nearing modernity, so let's make the final push. So as all of that comes to its conclusion, we are now pushing past the religious wars of Europe and moving into an age of enlightenment. Now, enlightenment sounds like a wonderful thing, and by and large, it has been good for us, but it had a number of changes of the ways of thinking that would be both good and bad. One, countries should be organized around identity, not specific kings. That's great, right? Except what if our identity doesn't match perfectly the new definition of what it is to be French? We could be citizens of the French king, but can we be French enough to match this definition if we're not going to give up our Jewish identity? They also believed that human beings had inherent dignity. This was very helpful. And they believed that individuals had rights to be protected, also absolutely essential. However, these rights and dignities are meant to be given only to individuals, and thus the group of Jews was often considered to be a target to be broken up into individuals. And as we are very communal, that was not an attitude that worked well for us. Critical thinking also became enshrined as being the way to solve all problems. That was a great step forward over the veneration of faulty and corrupt authority. However, it also was a bit of a false promise when critical thinking could then be used to say, well, my solution is clearly logical, and if you disagree with it, you must be illogical. And that was not so helpful. And like I said, proof was more important than authority. The biggest problem for us during this time period, though, was that national identity. Nationalism begins to rise. The group that fails to conform, we are being suspected. And that means that we had to find ways to adapt. And this is the beginning of the different movements in Judaism. Now, some Jews said, look, we need to fit in order to be accepted. They want to give us rights, they want to recognize our dignity, but they don't want us to be different. So we'll be more like them. And indeed, this was what was the beginning of the early Reform movement. Very important, the modern Reform movement does not follow this same attitude, but the early Reform movement believed that as much as was possible could be adopted from the host country and its culture, and that would make it easier for us to be accepted within that community. Many Jews, however, didn't agree with this, and in fact resented or hated those steps, and thus they began a reactionary movement against it. This became known as Orthodoxy. It's very important to recognize Orthodoxy is not the default. Orthodoxy is not what Jews used to be. Orthodoxy is what was born after the Reform movement as a reactionary movement. It is not the natural state, it is the reactionary state. A third group also formed during this time, and that was saying, look, whether you try to fit in or whether you try to just stay in your own little bubble, no matter what, you're never going to fit in Europe. They're never going to accept you. There will always be problems. We need to go somewhere where we can just be by ourselves. They became what we call Zionists. And when we talked about the history of Israel, we talked about this in much more detail. And the Zionists were the ones who began the idea of rekindling an independent Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. Which brings us to the summary of all modernity. And this is our conclusion, right? We have seen over the last 100 years the worst of nationalism in Germany, and we have seen the peak of Zionism with the foundation of Israel. We have seen large-scale assimilation and Jews simply disappearing into the surrounding countries. Now that they no longer have to join another religion, many Jews are simply choosing to be nothing. At the same time, however, we have seen enormous growth in Jewish learning in all communities. Reform, conservative, Orthodox, all of us have more classes going on now than ever before. There are more Jews learning now than ever before in Jewish history. It is cheaper, easier, more accessible. It's an absolute incredible time to be a Jew if you want to learn. However, we've also seen more closed-mindedness. Orthodoxy has become more isolationist and more rigid in ways that wouldn't have been imagined even 500 years ago, let alone 1,000 years ago. We have seen the conservative movement, that's us, try to recapture the organic blend of tradition and modernity, reminding ourselves that every Jewish community throughout history has had to make choices between what is right and what is wrong, and that those choices have to be carefully weighed and understood so that we can identify what is right and what is wrong. The contemporary needs of each generation are always part of that conversation and process. And that's something that we continue to work on. And indeed, that is how we will go forward. The story's not done. We are not past the end of history. History is still being written, and we are a part of it. And we are continuing each individually, just like Adam Rishon, the first human being, to choose to how we want to write our part of that history by the choices that we make. I think we went over 1 hour, so I apologize. If you were here for only 60 minutes, I hope you're not too disappointed. But that is the broad arc of Jewish history. And on each different slide that I had up here, you can find entire libraries of more books and knowledge. Go and learn it. All right, thank you all very much. And next week, we will be looking at the Friday night Shabbat service in more detail, much of which was written by the people who left Spain during the 1492 expulsion and went to Israel, to a nice little town called Sfat in the north of Israel. So it'll be a good continuation for that thread of our historical study. Take care, everyone.